So, do this Wednesday. Okay, that's in Duncan's website, the EduCat page. Okay, don't forget. Then I just posted this. This is new, okay? This is a homework assignment for you to prepare for the exam on Friday with regard to the bryophytes, which I'll be talking about today. So after today's lecture, you'll have the answers for this assignment. So it opens up at 1. If you did it soon after the lecture, that would be very efficient of you. So if you can get to it before too late, you have until whoops, I did it wrong again. What is with that? It's due Friday at 11. All right, I'll go in and shift that at the end of this lecture. Yes. Wednesday at 11. This one's Friday at 11. Friday. All right, but it opens today at 1. So we're going to cover more of the bryophytes today. The exam is on Friday. I'll tell you today what will be like the cutoff point for the exam material. It's mostly through some the mosses. That's that set of bryophytes, and just a little bit of some of the other stuff. I'll show you that as we go here. Okay. All right, bryophytes. We've been looking at bryophytes. We said they grow really slowly. No true roots or leaves, no true vascular tissue. They just absorb water and minerals through their body. They're petite, so they don't a lot of their petiteness has to do with no vascular tissue. So they tend to be very petite. They like moist habitats, although they're pretty good at surviving through drought if necessary. So they have chlorophyll A and B. They're like the higher plants that if they make extra sugar, they'll pack it away as starch for a rainy day, so to speak. The sperm are motile. So this is going to be a thing. We're going to talk about whether or not sperm are motile from this point forward. All right. So that's one thing that they noted with the bryophytes, which are the first to make it onto land. Their sperm are motile and free water is necessary. That's another thing we're going to talk about through the rest of the semester. All right, so believe it or not, those are important concepts, whether or not they're sperm or motile and whether or not they need free water in order to get the sperm to find the egg. All right. Now, the next topic, which that homework assignment is getting you to think about more too, is very important because moving forward from the rest of the semester, this is a thing that you need to know. So it's best if you learn it now so that it's not a struggle as you keep going through the rest of the semester. So this is the concept of alternation of generations. And all the land plants have this. And so I definitely am going to be asking about this on this exam on Friday. All right. So what we see is that the plants will spend part of their life in the so-called haploid phase and part of their life in the diploid phase. Now, haploid means you have half the number of chromosomes. We usually denote that as N or 1N. Diploid means you have a full complement of chromosomes. So then we say it's 2N. And this is the alternation of generations that you see on this figure. So when you look at the bryophytes, any plant, we always say, well, which phase is dominant? Which means which phase do they spend most of their time in? Okay, or which phase do you easily see with the naked eye? So for bryophytes, the gametophyte phase is dominant, which is a little weird. It's their haploid state. See, we're diploid organisms. You know, when you look at another human, they're diploid except for their sperm and egg. Okay, so it's a little weird. So bryophytes, they spend most of their time in the gametophyte phase. That's the phase that you see. That's the phase that persists. Okay, so what does that mean? And remember, PHYTE means anything plant-like. Gameto is referring to the gametes. All right, gametes. So we have I like to think of the gametophytes like they have a job. Part of their job is to make gametes. When they're living their life, that's part of their goal. All right, and so that's what you see here. They're making, in the gametophyte phase, they'll be able to make their sperm and eggs, which are haploid, okay? And so this is going on. Mitosis is just regular growth, okay? Regular growth, cell division and growth. And then if you want to get up to the full complement of chromosomes into the diploid phase, you have to have sperm and egg unite and fuse. And so that's the fertilization event. So I'll be asking you, like, what does it take to go from one phase to the other? All right, so you need to know, oh, well, to go from gametophyte, haploid, to the full diploid sporophyte, you gotta have sperm and egg fuse. You gotta have fertilization. Then I need you to know this term, zygote. This is showing up over and over again, all right, from this point forward. So when a sperm and egg fuse, then we start talking about a zygote, and it's the diploid, the beginning of the diploid phase. Then they're just gonna go through mitosis again. Lots of cell division, building tissue, mitosis, 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 and they'll build a special sporophyte phase. The job of the sporophyte is to make spores. So at least they named this stuff something you can link it to fairly easily. Okay, gametophytes make gametes, sperm and egg. Sporophyte make spores. That's their job. Okay, so sporophyte makes spores, gametophyte makes gametes. So I once, when I was learning the Finnish language over in Minnesota, there was, the teacher was I don't know, she's probably in her late 70s, early 80s, and she would just make us recite over and over and over of the cases, you know, I, you plural, you know, we, you got, you know, all of that. And to this day, I can rattle it off. And so that's kind of how I think about you learning this. If you just repeat it over and over, draw it over and over, say it out loud over and over, it's going to sink in pretty quickly. Okay. All right. So the sporophyte is the full diploid. If you want to go from the full diploid down to half the number of chromosomes, the gametophyte phase, you gotta go through meiosis for that. That's just the law of biology. You need to go through meiosis in order to have the number of chromosomes. So this is going back to BI 111, the very basics of mitosis and meiosis and what's going on when you talk about those ideas. Okay, but now we're putting it into context of how these plants live their life. So here you can see that once meiosis is all done, then the spores will get released. They're haploid. They're going to germinate and grow, mitosis, 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 into the gametophyte phase. And so last week, when you looked at some mosses, probably most of what you saw was the gametophyte phase. And then I don't know if you were able, I'll show you some sporophyte phases. You might have seen those. I don't know. So this is a good one to, especially with the bryophytes, just going over and over and over. I really encourage you to draw it out, speak it out, read it out loud. Questions on this right now? I'm guessing this is probably the first most of you have seen of this idea. They don't really cover this, I don't think, in like BI 111. Do they? A little bit? Oh, they actually cover it? I'm shocked. Usually they ignore plants.
Right, because what plants and how much their life and what's time will change.
Yes, absolutely. So with the bryophytes, they spend most of their time in the gametophyte phase, okay? So this is just the same thing blown up without the words on the top, all right? Okay, so let's look at it in words. When you think about the bryophytes, most of the time they can do asexual reproduction quite easily. They just can spread and clone themselves, so to speak. It's not that difficult. The gametophyte is the dominant phase. That's the phase they spend the longest time of their life in. It's the phase that we can easily see with the naked eye. When you're out hiking around, you'll see the gametophyte phase and sometimes the sporophyte phase. And so the job of the gametophyte is to make gametes, which are the egg and sperm. Where are they doing that? They're doing it in a special structure where you have, first of all, the antheridia, and that's site is where you're going to get sperm production. And so the way I remember this is that antheridia is close to the word antler. And I think about male deer having antlers. I know some female can have antlers too, but just let's go with it. Just say only males do it. And so males have antlers. And so that's how I remember antheridia is for sperm. If that helps you, go for it. So I'm going to show you that's a specialized structure that we're going to zoom into to look for that. And then if you peer inside the antheridia, it's packed with sperm, right? Just packed, lots and lots of sperm. The other site that we have to think about is the archegonia. And of course, if you look at this word, egg is right in it. Just add a G and you get eggs. So archegonia is where you're going to have eggs being produced. But with this, each archegonium singular has just one egg, one nice big plump egg. So it's kind of similar to the idea where humans, the males produce lots and lots of sperm, the females produce relatively few precious eggs. So in this case, really precious because it's one egg in each archegonium, okay? All right. So you need, going forward, this terminology stays put for quite a while now. So learn it now, antheridia and archegonia. That is going to persist for quite a while here. Yes.
If they produce asexually, how do they get it?
Yes. And the only way they can do that is sexual reproduction. And so, and they can, I mean, they definitely do go through sexual reproduction. I mean, every year I see a bunch of mosses going through sexual reproduction. So I don't know if, when they say most reproduction, that must be over all the different moss species that they've studied to date. But at least in this area of the world, I see a lot of sexual reproduction. So you're right, if it's asexual, they're not mixing up their genes, they're not getting diversity of genes. So that can really limit them. We say free water is necessary. So for the motile sperm to find the egg, you have to have free water they can swim in order to get to from the antheridia to the archegonia, which when you look at it, it's kind of amazing that they can reproduce sexually so fairly readily because of this limitation that you have to have free water. And so if the sperm and egg find each other and you get fusion, then that's fertilization. And then you say that cell is now the zygote. Okay. And then eventually that zygote will develop into the embryo, which is the baby gametophyte essentially. Or the baby, I guess, yeah, it would be the sporophyte. Sorry, I misspoke there. So let me go through this. Well, let's see. All right. Upon fertilization, you get a zygote, and then you get some more development, mitosis and growth, and it becomes the embryo, which then develops into the sporophyte. So by this, you can always, if you have separate male and female mosses, for example, which most are, you can always tell which one's female if there's a sporophyte, because you're like, oh, okay, that must have been the female, because in order to get the sporophyte, you have to have sperm and egg uniting, and the egg stays put. All right, it's only the sperm that's traveling around trying to find that egg. So that sporophyte has to grow and develop. It's just a bunch of mitosis to get the growth and differentiation into what we see then as the sporophyte. And we say this is important too, because we're going to see that this differs over time with different plants. The sporophyte is attached and dependent on the gametophyte. That means nutritionally dependent. All right, so the sporophyte can't make it out on its own. It can't break free physically and be on its own in any way. All right, so that's an important concept because that's going to shift over time with some of these other plant groups we'll look at. And then once the sporophyte has fully grown, then its job kicks in, which is to make spores. The specialized area of the sporophyte is called the sporangium. Again, at least they named it something that you can relate to. All right, so sporangium, and this is not unique to mosses. We use this term sporangium a lot. We use it in the fungal world too. And so the sporangium is just like this sac of tissue that will hold the spores. All right, so that's essentially what a sporangium is. And then they have to, those spores, before they'll get released, they need to go through meiosis because they need to get back into the haploid state. Because once those spores set free from the sporangium, they're going to develop into the gametophyte. So they have to be back into the haploid state for that. Okay, so this is pretty much in words, these last two slides, what that figure I was showing you. Okay, so you have it in words, you have the visual of the gametophyte and sporophyte phase and their jobs. So now let's put it into context of the mosses. So here, now we're seeing more detail and we're seeing the specialized structures where you can find sperm and egg and spores. So again, a lot of this terminology is going to follow into the next plant group. So it's good. At least they don't switch it up all the time on us. So here you can see, and I like how they put the gametophyte phase on the tops, you know, trying to get you to think that's dominant. Sporophyte phase is not the dominant phase. Okay, so here you have the male gametophyte. Oops. Okay, the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte. And the blue are water droplets. And then they say, okay, go to the tip of the male gametophyte and let's enlarge that. So that's what you're seeing here. So that's where you find the antheridia. Now, it's difficult to spot with the naked eye. You can train your eye to find it, but it's challenging. But if you had a hand lens, it'd be a little easier to see these little sacs of tissue. But you would need the microscope to really see what's going on inside. So all the like dark brown stuff, that's supposed to be the sperm. So they're trying to show that there's lots and lots of sperm in each antheridium. And they're trying to show you need that free water. So raindrop comes along and you have rain over the moss. And that will release the sperm and hopefully get splattered. Raindrops will splatter onto the female gametophyte. And again, it's in the tip. Most mosses have their reproductive structures in the tips on the, you know, the shoot tip. And so here you can see that there's several archegonia, but they're only showing one egg in each. Often it does look vase-like that, like a vase. And kind of tannish thing, that's the egg. So if everything goes okay and the sperm gets splashed over to the female moss and into the archegonium tissue, then you'll have the fertilization. So and then that egg just stays put. It doesn't move. It just stays put and starts to develop. And so it's at the tip here, starting to develop, okay? And it's gonna grow into the sporophyte. You have the zygote initially, that's the fused sperm and egg cell. And then just lots of mitosis, growth, differentiation until you have the sporophyte. And so did you see any mosses that look like this where there was two phases? Okay, so you know that was the female moss. And then the sporophyte is there. So the sporophyte phase is it's pretty ephemeral. It lasts for a stretch of time, but then dies off after the spores have been released, but the gametophyte phase persists. But here you can see the sporophyte does differentiate a little bit. You get a seta or stalk. And that's just to elevate the sporangium tissue to be a little bit more up in the air currents. Now remember, mosses are really petite, so you got to get up a little bit for the air current to release the spores after they've gone through meiosis. And depending on the moss species, they can kind of catapult their spores a little bit with how their sporangium tissue works. It just depends, but they're trying to show that the tops can pop off, so to speak. And you can get some decent spore dispersal with that process. And then they just show, okay, hopefully the spores land somewhere good and they'll start to germinate, go through lots of mitosis, and then you're back to the gametophyte phase of the moss. The really young stages of the gametophyte, they often refer to as protonema. That's just, you'll see that term probably on the slides too. Okay, so terminology on here too, you gotta know. So the archegonium, antheridium, zygote, sporophyte, spores, as well as the process of the alternation of generations. Yes.
Do the plants have both an anthurium and an archegonium, or?
In one, you mean? Most mosses have separate bodies, separate gametophytes for the antheridia, for the male and the female, essentially. Other questions on this process? Beautiful mosses. So this is the gametophyte phase that you're looking at. And depending on what species of moss you're looking at, they can be more feathery looking and more prostrate or more upright. And then this one in figure A, you have more of the upright gametophyte, and you also have the sporophyte phase there. So any one of those that has the sporophyte showing up, you know, that's the female. And so lots of different species of mosses out there. They're the biggest group of the bryophytes by far. They have persisted over all these years through the evolutionary process. So here you're looking down at a patch. This looks like mostly male gametophytes. And so they tend to have that kind of dainty cup-like look to the tip of the male gametophyte. And so if you take that and look at it under the microscope, the very tip of that, you know, so you can see here all of these. You take that tissue and look at it under the microscope, this is what you would see. All right, so here you can see all of the dark areas inside the antheridia. Eventually that's all going to be mature sperm. So you can see the male moss has lots and lots of antheridia. And in each antheridium, tons of sperm. So this really does increase their chance of success of getting some sperm over to the female egg. So lots and lots of sperm in order to hopefully get some sperm over to the egg of the female gametophyte moss. So here you're looking at both female and male. So on the left, you have the kind of vase-like appearance of each archegonium, and then the egg is forming, okay, just a single egg in each one. But hopefully if the male gametophyte is close and with all the sperm being produced, and then you get some rain action, hopefully you'll get the sperm over. And so this isn't the best slide representation, but this is one that was taken from lab. Not most of the archegonium don't have mature eggs in there yet, but here's a better one. Here you can see a little bit better delineation of the egg in that particular archegonium. So if the sperm get there and fertilize that egg and a zygote forms, then you'll get lots of mitosis and the sporophyte starts to emerge. Start to see it with the naked eye. So this image is a young sporophyte. The reason I know it's young is that it still has a green sporangium tissue. The stalk still has a color to it, in this case, kind of a magenta color. They start out like that, especially the sporangium tends to be green initially. And that's one nice visual that you know that they're pretty young. They haven't finished their job yet of making spores. It's going, but it's not quite done yet. All right. So then over time, once the sporophyte matures and spores are being produced and they start going through meiosis, they'll look more like that. And so you can see the stalk has kind of faded in color. The sporangium tissue has gone from green to more of a brown. The sporangium tissue dries out, it gets dehydrated, and that's important because that does help with the dispersal. That drying action creates an actual tension on the tissue to the point where it can cause it to break open. And then that breaking is usually, or splitting is usually abrupt enough that it can spread the spores at least a little distance. So you can see, depending on the species, this is a Bryum species, the spore tip, the sporangium area, and you can see some spores are lurking out there, but this is with microscope image. Here's another really beautiful one showing the tip of the sporangium. There's another one. So this is, you're only seeing a partial of the sporangium tissue, and then this is the very tip. You can start to see the spores in there. So once those spores have gone through meiosis, then they'll get released and land somewhere suitable nearby, hopefully. And then we start calling that the gametophyte phase, of course. And when it's initially growing really young, we'll say that it's the protonema. You would need a hand lens with to see this. It's pretty difficult to see, especially under natural settings. In the lab, if you have a more artificial substrate to view these, it's easier. But you can see a little bit of the rhizoid tissue, so they need to attach to some kind of substrate, but they don't have true roots. That's just for attachment. So definitely the mosses win in the sense that currently they're the largest group. They beat out the other two, which are the hornworts and the liverworts. We say that their gametophyte body is radially symmetrical. And the reason I'm pointing this out is that the liverworts are not that way. And sometimes it can be challenging when you're out in a natural setting to tell the difference sometimes between a moss and a leafy liverwort. And so this is the mantra I always try to remember, that mosses are radially symmetrical. And that just means if you look at the gametophyte portion of the moss, you could slice it in half any which way down the length of the moss gametophyte, and you'll have mirror images. Each half will look like a mirror image. That's not, so we're bilaterally symmetrical. There's only one way to cut us in half from top to bottom to have a mirror image. And so, but with mosses, you could imagine cutting them any which way down their length, and no matter how you do it, the two halves are identical. So usually they're unisexual, which means there's separate male mosses and then a separate female. Okay, so the gametophytes are male and female. Usually you find the Archegonia tissue, Antheridia tissue at the tips. Okay, these are not mosses. I could just shake the people who name these. Irish moss is not a moss. Do you know what it is? We actually already covered them. Algae. So Chondrus crispus, that's Irish moss. So I don't know who named them Irish moss, but they should be chastised. Reindeer moss, that's a lichen. Again, chastise that person. What are you thinking? Club moss, we haven't covered these yet.
Their liver.
No, they're ahead of they're further along the evolutionary timeline. They're a type of seedless vascular plant. So we'll get to them eventually. But again, they're not a moss. Spanish moss, that's even further along. That is an angiosperm. It's like, what are you thinking? Well, I mean, I'll show you a picture of Spanish moss eventually, and you can kind of understand why they said it's a moss, but still.
Look, naming things, and they've never been good at it. They will call it peacock mantis. It's neither. It's none of those three things. None of those are correct.
I know. It's like, so anyways, I'm glad we, at least we have the scientific names to try to really keep things as straight as possible all the way around the world. But unfortunately, a lot of these common names persist. And so I'm not, I'm not as miffed about these as I am blue-green algae. That one really bothers me. These bother me, but for some reason the blue-green algae really gets to me. But anyway, so these are not mosses, so just be aware of that. But these are mosses, some beautiful mosses, gorgeous. Especially if you bring out a hand lens with you as you're out hiking and just train your eye to look for petite things. They're everywhere around here, everywhere, in town too. They are highly successful and they can grow in places that vascular plants cannot. This is out west, the Olympic National Park. This is on my bucket list. I gotta get there. And my one friend from grad school went there and she was showing me images on her tablet. And I mean, the green, it was so green, it kind of hurt your eyes. It was just so intensely green because of all the mosses at that park. It's just amazing. I mean, just branches just covered, tree trunks covered, rocks covered. And so the Olympic National Park out in Washington State is the only rainforest in the continental United States. It's a temperate, not a tropical. It's a temperate rainforest. But that's from, I can't remember. It's the Olympic National Park, but I have one of these images in my living room, not this particular one, but close to it. It's like, it's my dream, part of my dream board. It's like, someday I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna get there. And then some beautiful photography here. I did not take that, but that's just such a nice capture of the water droplets on the sporophyte. So they're everywhere if you start training your eye and look at them, and they are so cute when you look at them in detail. So they can live in places vascular plants can't. They don't rely on the soil for their water. They don't rely on the soil for their minerals. So they don't have to have soil. So they can grow on concrete, rooftops. They're kind of similar to lichen in that regard, where they can grow pretty much anywhere and they're just fine. Oh, and by the way, like I have mosses on my garage roof because a tree is shading it. And I know like one of my neighbors who likes to tell me what to do, he's like, you need to get rid of that moss. He's not in any way a scientist or a biologist. And I'm like, okay, thanks for the advice. And if I'm in the right mood, I'll try to educate him, but sometimes I'm not in the right mood. And there has been no proof anywhere. And I even can talk to a construction person who's been in the construction industry for, a couple decades. There's no proof that the presence of moss on your roofs is doing any damage to the shingles. My garage is shingled. There's no evidence. So don't panic if you have moss on.
Damage from plants on structures is like something big drops. Right?
Yeah, right.
Roots.
Right.
Roots.
No, exactly. So they're not like, fungi where they're excreting really aggressive enzymes and things like that. They don't do that, so it's like, it's not harming. And so when I talked to a construction management expert and he actually said, no, it's fine to have moss on your roof. I'm like, thank you. I should have had him quote that and sign off on it.
Like strictly wood roof or like
Shingles, so shingle, that's like asphalt type roofs. I don't really see them on metal roofs.
pretty much wood. Suffering from like it's like
I'm guessing it's not so much the moss. I'm guessing the fungi are there causing that, and you don't see the fungi because the moss are kind of covering. But so as far as I know, that would be my guess. It's the fungi that are decomposing because mosses they just live there.
it's
Yes, and that would make the fungi want to be there too. So no ocean dwelling or marine species have been found yet. Some freshwater have been found. And if you look at really hostile, what we would consider hostile environments like the Arctic and Antarctic, they're more numerous than the vascular plants, which makes sense again because of the way that they get access to their nutrients and their ability to withstand long periods of things, you know, where they're like, okay, I better go dormant for a while and just hang out. And so they can tolerate fairly long periods of dark, freezing. They're a little tougher that way. And okay, so you're gonna see some experts saying mosses can't form mycorrhizal relationships, but I found some published journal articles that negate that. So you're going to see that debate still, though. There's some scientists who don't know that, but at least the papers I read, it seemed pretty plausible. They don't have roots. So remember, with mycorrhizal fungi, we say they associate with the roots. Mosses don't have true roots, but they still associate with like the rhizoid areas of the bryophyte. But you're going to hear some people say that this doesn't happen. So just be aware that there's still some misinformation about that. So they are very important in the ecosystems because they are usually like lichens. They're the first into an area that's been disturbed. If you think about fire sweeping over an area and just obliterating everything, lichens and bryophytes can come in. And like the lichens, they're sensitive to pollution because they're absorbing everything through their whole body. They don't have an excretory system of any kind. Sulfur dioxide, just like with the lichens, can really hit them. And so that's why it's so wonderful to see all these mosses in Marquette, downtown, in the middle of the city. They're everywhere, just like the lichens. And so they accumulate over time, the heavy metals, the sulfur dioxide. There are some species that are pretty good at adapting to, you know, pretty harsh conditions. You can find them in deserts. There's some species, not a lot, that you can find. So the pictures down below are the Tortula. It's called Tortula rurale. And they're really studying this one because they want to figure out how it can survive drought so well. And is there any way we can learn from that to grow like agricultural crops, maybe genetically modified to handle drought better through, you know, what we learned from this particular moss. So it's really quite impressive how long it can deal with being without water and of course the minerals. And so they're really looking at that. They say after a few minutes of rain, the plants are rehydrated and fully functional. So they're very quick to capitalize on rain. Doesn't take them very long to get up and running. But when drought hits, they can, for long stretches of time, they can be dormant. Peat moss is an interesting moss. That's probably the one you're most familiar with. If you buy like potting soil, it often has peat moss mixed in. And that's because of this. It's so good at absorbing water. So all of these non-green cells of the gametophyte are for water absorption, and they're just packed with water. And so, you know, it can absorb 20 to 25 times its weight in water. So it's really good to have in potting soil because it helps keep your soil moist consistently for stretches of time. So if you forget to water your plants, it's not the end of the world. You have to go to peat bogs for this to find them. And so that's pretty acidic areas, pH 3. For a moss, they do grow quicker than a lot of other species. And I know that some people say, well, you know, it's an unsustainable practice of harvesting peat moss, but at least it's one of the quickest moss species out there in terms of its growth rate. So this last point here, you might want to put a question mark, source of renewable energy. Some people say that, other people don't. Other people say, no, it's not sustainable. And so I think it depends on very much the practice of the people that are doing the harvesting. Canada is a big exporter of sphagnum peat moss. And I've read a lot of their, you know, website information, and they say it's renewable. Other people will point to that and say, not so much. So that's still a debate that's going on. One of its historic claims to fame is that it's really good at being an antiseptic because it's low pH and it does produce certain acids that they used to use it for wounds. World War I, that's before antibiotics. So they, if you had especially, gunshot wounds, burn wounds, whatever, they would often pack the wound, dress it with sphagnum peat moss, and then put the cotton dressing over that. And the acid and the antibacterial property really helped the soldiers. It was very successful. The nurses came up with, from what I read, some nurses discovered this through, because they had learned in their family that this was a totally legit way to deal with wounds and keep them from getting infected. Native Americans would pack the diaper that they had with sphagnum peat moss because it absorbs urine so well. It's it's antibacterial, so the baby's bottom wouldn't get infected in any way or irritated. They used it for oil spills. You can pack fish or shellfish with it because it helps preserve the fish as it goes a couple thousand miles in transit to get to somebody's grocery store. And again, it keeps it very fresh. So a lot of uses for sphagnum peat moss. I don't really see this, it's going to be harvested for many years to come unless they can find a suitable replacement that's this good at so many things. And so this is probably the most famous moss that most people are aware of. So a peat bog. And so often if you went to any peat bogs already in your career here, you've been walking on peat moss as you go out on those floating bogs and hopefully don't sink in. Lots of fun. Yeah, so this is Bogman. That's the nickname, but this is 2,000-year-old human remains found in a bog, a peat bog, with skin still attached. I mean, this is amazing because there was no decomposition. The sphagnum peat moss kept all the microbes that normally decompose a body at bay. So if you're trying to get rid of a body, don't put it in a peat bog.
That's there forever.
It's there forever.
They thought,
So-
I think what they found, they thought this was a recent murder victim.
Yeah, probably. They think this person was a little bit over 20 when he died, but I think he was murdered, I think.
He has a noose around.
Yeah.
That's like,
So
probably wasn't like.
either murdered just for being murdered or sacrificed if
Did they sacrifice him to the bog?
yeah, I don't know. So here they are harvesting. So, fresh sphagnum is good as an antiseptic because it's living, it's, still producing the antibacterial, but then once you harvest it and dry it, then it's good to burn. Okay, but you have to get rid of the water. So you got to harvest it, dry it. So pretty much it's dead by that point. But then it's still good because then you can burn it as one way of using it. So depends on what you want to use it for, but it is still used rather than, not just burning wood for heat. A lot of places over in Europe will still burn peat. And if you are into peaty whiskey, they still do it this way, where they will, this is from Lafroig's website, which is a very peaty whiskey. If anyone is over 21 and ever sampled any of this, has anyone sampled peaty whiskey? I have.
It sounds good.
No, it's literally like you are swallowing liquid soil. I mean, it
It
tastes,
tastes like dirt.
yeah, it tastes like dirt to me, and some people love it. And
Some people like dirt a lot more than they think they do.
yeah, so they call it an earthy aroma
Yeah,
and
that's.
smoky flavor,
Putting
and
it
that's
lightly.
pretty much it. But they actually take the barley, from, so the barley is coming from an angiosperm. And you take the barley seeds and you start to dry it over the peat fire. And so you get all the smokiness from the peat fire. And then they bottle it and age it, and that's that's what it tastes like. So, if you're into it, it's a lot of people just are all over it. I have in the notes, a little bit how they do that from their website. So, um, and then if you're around here, you can see mosses everywhere. And a lot of the times they're hand in hand with lichens on rocks and rooftops and cemeteries on the gravestones. Some are luminous near caves where they don't get a lot of light and they're so delicate looking. And so you can find them often near caves. I'll leave my little field guide to mosses in the lab for Thursday, so you can peek through some of that. But she gets into a lot of, whoops, not that one. She gets into a lot of these mosses. So, okay. So this slide set, I just finished the first slide set on mosses as bryophytes. So this will be on the exam on Friday. There's a couple of other slides in the next slide set I wanted to mention because they're going to be on the exam as well. But let me get to that. So the next slide set is looking at the liverworts and the hornworts. And let's see. So on this slide set, if you go to the very last slide, in that slide set, you have the table. So remember, I did say from this point forward, like with the algae moving forward, I want you to know phylum names now. Okay, so here are the three phyla. In the bryophytes, you have the Bryophyta, are the mosses, and then the Hepatophyta are the liverworts, and then Anthocerophyta or Anthocerophyta are the hornworts. And so I will be asking questions like which one is more abundant. So that first column gets you there. And then most of this stuff I've covered in what we just talked about with the mosses. That's pretty much everything I covered already, at least with what I see in the row on mosses. But let me say a few things about a couple of things about the liverworts. There's two main body types. You have the leafy or the thallose. The leafy is more abundant, believe it or not, even though in intro botany classes, we tend to spend a lot of time on the thallose, but that's because they have interesting body morphology. The leafy, though, is actually more abundant. You can find more species. So that's important for you to know for Friday, okay? So 80% of all known liverworts are the leafy type. And they're bilaterally symmetrical. So that's different. That's how I tell the difference between a leafy liverwort and a moss. I have to think about that idea when I'm out hiking around. And so there's only one way to cut a liverwort to get mirror images of the halves. They're a little bit happier being water soaked. They like to be pretty wet. They're really abundant in tropical environments. And you look for this pattern of two rows of leaves that partially overlap in the middle. And that is another dead giveaway. Look for that and bilateral symmetry. And then you know you have a liverwort, not a moss. Thallose is only 20% of the known species that are in that form. And they look flat and they often say ribbon-like. Marchantia is the guinea pig model for the thallose. And it has some interesting asexual reproduction capabilities that I'll show you. And you probably will look at this in lab too on Thursday, where they have these so-called splash cups. They're cute little pieces of tissue that hold little tiny pieces of tissue called gemma. And that's how they asexually reproduce. It's just these little tiny bits of tissue that will get splashed out of these cute little cups. And that's their version of kind of cloning themselves and spreading. Okay. So I'm not going to get into the life cycle of liverworts, but Here again is a blow up of a leafy liverwort. And so you can see there's 2 rows of leaves and then they partially overlap. When you look at them. And then the thallus. Okay, and then, so the rest of this slide, one other thing I want you to know is this. This is probably the most common. Most people interact with liverworts in this way. Let's put it that way. If you ever have aquaria and you buy Reishi, that's a liverwort. And most people don't know that. They think it's a moss, right? But it's a liverwort. And it's used to aerate your aquaria because it's very good at doing photosynthesis and producing a lot of oxygen. So most people, that's how they interact with liverworts. Okay, we'll stop there. And on Wednesday, we'll get into a little bit more of the liverworts. Don't forget your quiz, lab quiz, and then the homework assignment. And I'll switch that due date to Friday at 11.